When I was reborn on the day my sister and I chose our husbands, I suddenly heard everyone's thoughts. When I opened my eyes and realized I had returned to the exact day my sister and I were supposed to choose our husbands, the first thing I heard was a voice that had not come from anyone's mouth. This time, I'll be the first one to give birth to an heir. My younger sister, Celeste Bennett, stood beside me with her hands folded neatly in front of her. To everyone else in the hall, she looked shy, graceful, and perfectly composed. Her lips never moved, yet her excitement rang through my head so clearly that I instinctively turned toward her. Her gaze was fixed on the bouquet of white roses resting in the center of the ceremonial table, and the hunger in her eyes was impossible to miss once I knew what to look for. Then another thought reached me. I'll take him before Evelyn can. This time, everything she had will belong to me. That was when I understood two impossible things at once. I had been reborn, and somehow, I could hear the thoughts of the people around me. More importantly, Celeste had been reborn too. There was no other reason she would be thinking about becoming the first to produce an heir or stealing the life I had lived before. She remembered everything, just as I did. She remembered our marriages, the Ashford family's succession struggle, and the violent ending that had sent both of us back to this moment. Two bouquets rested on the table before us. The black roses represented Damien Ashford, the eldest son of the Ashford family and the first in line to inherit its enormous business empire. He sat several feet away in a dark suit, leaning back in his chair with an expression so controlled that he might have been carved from stone. He was handsome, powerful, and famously untouchable. His eyes revealed nothing, and the cold pressure surrounding him made nearly everyone in the hall instinctively keep their distance. The white roses represented Damien's younger half-brother, Julian Ashford. Julian was born outside the family's formal marriage, which placed him in a weaker position within the family, but he had always known how to compensate for that disadvantage. A gentle smile rested on his face. He looked warm, considerate, and approachable, especially beside Damien's intimidating silence. In my previous life, that contrast had deceived almost everyone, including me. Before I could fully organize my memories, Celeste stepped forward. She picked up the white roses, without hesitation, pressed a delicate kiss to the petals, and carried them directly to Julian. "Mr. Ashford," she said softly, lowering her eyes as though she were overwhelmed by modesty, "I hope you'll take care of me from now on." The headmistress of the bridal academy smiled approvingly. "Since Celeste has chosen Julian, Evelyn will marry Damien." A flash of triumph crossed Celeste's face before she managed to hide it. Her thoughts, however, were much louder than her expression. "Enjoy living like a widow. You have no idea what you've just lost." In our previous life, Celeste had chosen Damien. She wanted to become the wife of the Ashford heir and eventually take control of the family's social and financial influence. Damien possessed an almost frightening instinct for business. Within a few years, he had expanded the Ashford companies across Europe and turned an already powerful family into an international force. Celeste had assumed that marrying him would guarantee wealth, status, and a position no one could challenge. What she had not anticipated was Damien himself. He spent most of the year in the private suite above the Ashford corporate headquarters and allowed almost no one into his personal space. Celeste had tried everything to attract him. She wore revealing nightclothes and appeared at his door after midnight. She used business documents as excuses to enter his study. Once, during one of his trips, she even slipped into his hotel room and waited for him there. Every attempt ended the same way. Damien removed her without hesitation, refused to reward her manipulation with even an argument, and returned to his work as though she were an interruption he had already forgotten. Their marriage never became intimate, and Celeste never became pregnant. Eventually, the Ashford matriarch, Beatrice, publicly blamed Celeste for failing to produce an heir. At a family banquet, Beatrice announced that there must be something wrong with Celeste's body and removed her from the family residence. It was cruel, humiliating, and unfair, but Celeste never blamed the family structure that had reduced her worth to pregnancy. She blamed me. I had married Julian in that life. Everyone believed I had received the lesser husband. He was the illegitimate son. He had no guaranteed inheritance, and he appeared to possess none of Damien's authority. Yet after our wedding, Julian surrounded me with attention. He accompanied me when I went shopping, arranged late-night dinners, brought me gifts, and stayed close enough that other people praised him for being devoted. I mistook that constant presence for love. By the time I recognized the control underneath it, I had already become deeply entangled in his life. I gave birth to triplets, which strengthened Julian's position inside the family. Then Damien died unexpectedly. The medical examination found evidence of long-term heavy metal poisoning, but no one could identify the person responsible. With Damien gone and my children securing the next generation, Julian inherited the Ashford empire. Overnight, I went from being the wife of the disregarded younger son to becoming the most influential woman in the family. Celeste could not endure it. She invited me to go shopping with her, acted as though she wanted to repair our relationship, and led me to the rooftop of a department store. Once we were alone, she grabbed me and pulled both of us toward the edge. As we fell, the last thing I heard was her screaming, "Why do you get to live better than I do?" Now, standing in the bridal academy with a second life unfolding in front of me, I finally understood what she had decided. She believed Julian had been responsible for my success. She believed his obsession had been love, my triplets had been luck, and Damien's death had been a fortunate accident that opened the path to the family fortune. She wanted my ending without understanding what it had cost me to reach it. I looked at her delighted face and smiled. "That's perfectly fine," I said. "I happen to prefer Damien." I picked up the bouquet of black roses and walked toward him. With every step, the atmosphere seemed to grow colder. I understood why Celeste had struggled to breathe around him in our previous life. Damien did not need to threaten anyone. His stillness created its own warning. I tried to listen for his thoughts, but there was only silence. Everyone else's mind seemed to brush against mine in scattered fragments, but Damien's remained completely closed. There was no excitement, annoyance, suspicion, or curiosity that I could detect. He simply watched me approach. Then Julian casually ran his fingers over the petals of the white roses and looked at Celeste. His smile remained gentle, but his thoughts slipped into my mind with horrifying clarity. "She's beautiful. I wonder how much prettier she'll look when she's completely broken." My hands trembled around the black roses. That single thought confirmed something I had been too frightened to admit in my previous life. Julian's affection had never been affection. He had not loved me. He had studied me, controlled me, and enjoyed the process of reducing my world until he was the only person left inside it. Damien noticed the movement of my fingers. He lifted his eyes to mine, then reached out and accepted the bouquet. Without ceremony, he pinned one of the black roses to his chest. "Thank you," I said quietly. He gave a small nod and withdrew his hand. His expression remained cold, but his fingers had been warm. For the first time since waking in this new life, I felt a sense of safety. Damien's danger was visible. Julian's danger smiled, held doors open, and asked whether you had eaten before tightening the cage around you. I made a promise to myself in that moment. I would not exchange dependence on one man for dependence on another. I wanted to survive, but survival alone was no longer enough. I wanted my own money, my own authority, and the right to make decisions without begging anyone for permission. Damien might become my husband, but I would never again surrender my fate to the man standing beside me. Our weddings were scheduled for the same day and held together at the Ashford estate. Early that morning, 2 wedding dresses arrived. In my previous life, Damien had not attended his wedding to Celeste. He had remained at the office, treating the ceremony as a family obligation that could be completed without him. Julian, by contrast, had arrived before sunrise to oversee every detail of my wedding. Guests praised him for being attentive, and I had been grateful for every carefully performed gesture. The same pattern repeated in this life. Julian personally delivered Celeste's dress, while one of Damien's drivers brought mine. Julian carried Celeste's box upstairs himself and said, "I don't trust anyone else to handle something this important." Celeste threw her arms around him and kissed him. Then she glanced toward me with open satisfaction. "Damien didn't bring your dress himself?" I ran my hand over the lid of my box. "No, but the dress he selected was the final piece offered at a Paris auction. There isn't another one like it. I'm very happy with his choice." Her smile tightened. Inside her mind, she sneered, "Let's see how proud you look when it tears open in front of the entire family." I kept my expression calm until she and Julian left. Then I locked the door and examined the dress. At first, everything appeared perfect. The silk was untouched, the beadwork was secure, and there were no visible cuts. Only after turning the waistline inside out did I find the problem. Someone had loosened an entire row of stitching and concealed the damage beneath the inner lining. The dress would hold while I stood still, but one firm movement would cause the waist to split. In my previous life, Celeste's wedding dress had torn during the ceremony. She had accused the servants, screamed at the seamstress, and left the reception in tears. The family remembered her humiliation far longer than they remembered the sabotage. Now I knew she had planned to give that disaster to me. I found a sewing kit, repaired every weakened stitch, and added several hidden fasteners beneath the lining. I did not confront Celeste because doing so would only warn her that I knew what she was attempting. I needed to understand how far she was willing to go, and hearing her thoughts gave me an advantage only as long as she believed her plans remained secret. By evening, the estate was filled with guests. Crystal glasses reflected the lights from the chandeliers, and conversations flowed across the main hall as business partners, relatives, and social figures waited for the ceremony. As expected, Damien did not appear. I stood alone beneath the Ashford family crest while whispers moved through the room. Some guests pitied me. Others treated Damien's absence as proof that our marriage would never be real. For several minutes, the embarrassment pressed against me so strongly that I understood why Celeste had lost control in the previous life. Then she entered with Julian's hand resting at her waist. Her cheeks were flushed, and her steps were slightly unsteady. She leaned against him dramatically and said, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear, "My waist is so sore." Julian laughed and began rubbing her back. Celeste watched me, waiting for anger or jealousy. She wanted me to storm out, create a scene, or demand to know why Damien had abandoned me. That was exactly what she had done in her first life. Her outburst had convinced Beatrice that she lacked the composure required of the eldest daughter-in-law, and from then on, every small mistake became another reason to criticize her. I would not repeat it. I lifted my champagne glass and addressed the guests with a calm smile. Damien is handling an important business matter that could not be postponed. He asked that the celebration continue without disruption. During the family remarks, I'll speak on his behalf. I hope everyone will enjoy the evening. The whispers faded. Beatrice Ashford sat at the main table, her silver hair arranged perfectly, and her posture as straight as ever. She studied me for several seconds, then gave the smallest approving nod. In the Ashford family, appearances were not a superficial concern. They were part of the family's authority. A woman in my position was expected to hold the room together, even when her husband was absent. Celeste noticed Beatrice's reaction. Irritation flashed across her face. Enjoy it while you can, she thought. You'll humiliate yourself when the necklaces are presented. That warning gave me time to prepare. According to tradition, the family matriarch presented each bride with an inherited rose necklace. The black rose necklace belonged to the wife of the eldest son, while the white rose necklace was given to the younger son's wife. Shortly before the ceremony, attendants placed both velvet boxes in a dressing room while they adjusted the display table. I excused myself, entered the room, and inspected them. The clasp on the black rose necklace had been partially filed through. The damage was nearly invisible, but the weakened metal would snap as soon as the necklace settled against my neck. Celeste had likely expected the diamonds to scatter across the floor while 200 guests watched. I did not have enough time to replace the entire clasp, but I carried several small jewelry components in my own case. I exchanged the internal springs in both clasps and reinforced the black one before returning the boxes exactly as I had found them. When the presentation began, I walked toward Beatrice. Celeste stood 3 steps to my left, smiling sweetly, while counting in her head. 3, 2, 1. Beatrice lifted the black rose necklace and fastened it around my neck. The clasp closed with a soft click. I waited. Nothing happened. The necklace remained secure. For one brief second, Celeste's smile disappeared. Beatrice then placed the white rose necklace around her neck. The moment the clasp closed, a sharp snap echoed through the hall. The necklace broke, and dozens of diamonds scattered across the polished marble floor. Some rolled beneath tables. Others disappeared into the narrow lines between the tiles. Every conversation stopped. Celeste grabbed her throat and stared down in disbelief. Her thoughts came through in frantic fragments. That wasn't supposed to happen. The black clasp was damaged. How did she change it? I crouched and began collecting the nearest stones. It's all right, I said at the volume the room needed. The setting was old. These can be reset by the family jeweler. Beatrice looked at the broken necklace, then at Celeste, and finally at me. Her expression remained controlled, but her silence carried more judgment than an accusation would have. Celeste recovered quickly and forced a convincing smile, yet the moment had already passed. Beatrice turned away from her. The rest of the wedding proceeded without another incident. Celeste had invested her efforts in the dress and the necklace, and once both traps failed, she had nothing prepared. When the family toasts began, I stood in Damien's place and spoke carefully. I referred to continuity, responsibility, and the family's obligations to the people who depended on its businesses. Those were the themes Beatrice valued, and I had learned them during my previous life by watching from the edges of Ashford gatherings. When I returned to my chair, a small wooden box rested on the seat beside me. It bore the Ashford seal in black wax, but no name. Inside was a signed authorization card, granting me the right to speak for Damien at family functions whenever he was absent. 2 Ashford attorneys had witnessed it. The document had taken effect before the ceremony began. Damien had expected his absence to place me in a difficult position, and he had quietly given me the authority to handle it. He had not asked whether I was capable. He had simply made sure no one could challenge me if I proved that I was. I set the card on the table without drawing attention to it. Across the hall, Julian noticed. His gaze moved from the seal to my face, and remained there a moment too long. His arm tightened around Celeste's waist. She has that already, he thought. The word already stayed with me. Julian had expected me to gain influence eventually, but not so quickly. His concern was not about romance or family harmony. He was measuring positions on a board only he could see. After the wedding, I was taken to Damien's residence. The house was large, quiet, and organized with almost severe precision. Every object had a designated place. Nothing was decorative without purpose, and nothing appeared soft enough to suggest that comfort had ever been a priority. It felt like the home of a man who controlled his environment because he had learned not to trust the people inside it. Damien was still at work, so one of the maids showed me through the rooms. Her name was Ruth, and her thoughts were transparent. She worried that I would criticize the linens, change the household schedule, or dismiss employees simply to demonstrate authority. Her concerns were ordinary and practical, which made me trust her more than any rehearsed welcome could have. The kitchen staff were similarly harmless. One cook worried about whether I had dietary restrictions. Another servant wondered whether breakfast would need to be served earlier. Then a man brought me a tray of evening tea. and the thoughts inside his head were different. 3 days from now, use the capsule from the blue tin. He never notices the taste. I lifted the cup, pretending to examine it, then placed it back on the tray. The water seems slightly too cool, I said pleasantly. Please prepare a fresh pot. He bowed and removed it. I watched him leave before walking to Damien's private study. I did not know whether the capsule was poison, medicine, or something intended to make him ill. I only knew the man believed he could place it in Damien's tea without being detected. I sat at the desk and wrote down the exact wording of his thought, the time, the description of the tray, and everything I could remember about him. Damien returned shortly after 2 in the morning. He found me sitting at his desk with several pages spread in front of me. He remained in the doorway for a long moment. "This is my study," he said. "I know. I needed a place where the servants couldn't overhear me." His gaze moved to the paper. "What happened?" "There's a man on your staff who serves the evening tea. I believe he intends to add something from a blue tin 3 days from now. It may not be immediately dangerous, but I think he has done something similar before." Damien's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened. I slid the written account toward him. "I'm not asking you to trust my conclusion. Have the tea, the tin, and anything else he handles tested by a laboratory you choose. Watch him without alerting him. If I'm wrong, you lose nothing. If I'm right, the problem began before tonight." He looked down at the paper. "How did you learn this?" I could not tell him that I had died once, returned to the past, and awakened with the ability to hear thoughts. At best, he would believe I was unstable. At worst, he would recognize the value of my ability before I understood whether he could be trusted. "I pay attention," I said. He read my notes carefully, folded the pages, and placed them inside his jacket. He did not thank me or promise to investigate. He simply left the room. I went to the bedroom prepared for me and slept more peacefully than I had in either life. 3 days later, someone else brought my morning tea. I did not ask what had happened to the previous servant. That afternoon, Damien stopped when we passed in the corridor. "You were correct. About the capsule and about the longer history. The substance had been administered in low amounts over time. That explained why Damien's poisoning had taken so long to kill him in our previous life. It also meant the plan was already underway. Julian had not acted after inheriting an opportunity created by Damien's death. He had been preparing Damien's death long before anyone suspected him. Damien watched me with the same focused expression he used when studying a business report. "How did you know it was cumulative?" "I recognized the pattern," I answered carefully. He held my gaze for an extra second. For most people, that pause would have meant nothing. Damien rarely gave anyone more attention than necessary, so I understood it as the beginning of trust. At Celeste's house, Julian's devotion began revealing its true shape within the first few weeks of their marriage. I heard her thoughts during the first Sunday luncheon at the Ashford estate. "He told me what time I'm allowed to eat. He wants a doctor to check my hormone levels twice a week. He says I shouldn't walk too far, and now he doesn't want me visiting Evelyn unless he's there." Celeste sat across from me, smiling while Julian spoke to several relatives. She had wanted a husband who stayed near her, touched her, and made her the center of his attention. Now she was beginning to understand that constant attention could become surveillance. The cage had been built from affectionate gestures, and only now was she noticing the bars. I said nothing. Warning her would not make her trust me. She had murdered me for possessing the life she wanted, sabotaged my wedding dress, and attempted to humiliate me in front of the entire Ashford family. She would interpret concern as jealousy and run directly back to Julian with anything I said. By the second month, maintaining the appearance of happiness required visible effort. Celeste still laughed at Julian's jokes, but there was a delay before each smile. She looked toward him before answering simple questions, as if checking whether the response would please him. During a family tea, she approached me in the garden while Julian was speaking with an estate manager. She sat beside me and asked quietly, "Is Damien always this cold? Cold in what way? He barely comes home. He runs most of the family's businesses. His schedule has always been demanding." Something flickered in her expression. Her unspoken thought reached me immediately. "Julian is always home and I can't breathe." She did not say it aloud. Before she could continue, Julian returned. He placed his hand against the small of her back and leaned close to whisper something. Celeste laughed automatically while thinking, "Please stop touching me. Just leave me alone for 5 minutes." Watching them brought me back to the rooftop in our previous life. Celeste had asked why I lived better than she did, but neither of us had truly understood my life then. I had not been happier. I had simply been surviving a different prison. The Ashford Inheritance Board met 2 months after the wedding. The conference room had no windows, and portraits of former family leaders covered the walls. Damien sat at the head of the long table. My chair had been placed directly to his right. I could not tell whether the arrangement was deliberate, but I had learned that very little around Damien happened by accident. Julian sat several seats across from us. His smile remained polished, but the thoughts beneath it had become increasingly urgent. If the medical results are not what they promised, if Celeste cannot. He stopped himself before completing the thought. That disturbed me more than anything he might have finished. Julian had trained himself to interrupt his own thinking whenever it approached a subject he wanted hidden. He was becoming aware that someone around him might know more than they should, even if he did not understand how. The meeting itself concerned quarterly performance and several routine business decisions. Near the end, an older board member raised a question about succession. If Damien died without children, would Julian's status as the younger half-brother give him a claim to the family's controlling interest? Julian answered before anyone else could speak. I would never presume to benefit from my brother's absence. Damien is in excellent health, and I fully support his continued leadership. His voice was warm, and he looked directly at Damien. His hands rested motionless on the table. They were too still. An innocent person might have been surprised, uncomfortable, or irritated by the question. Julian looked like a man delivering a line he had practiced many times. After the meeting, Damien remained behind with me. He continued reading the documents in front of him and said, he rehearsed that answer. Yes, you noticed his hands. I noticed that nothing about him changed when the question was raised. Damien finally looked up. I've been experiencing headaches for approximately 4 months. That would be consistent with repeated low-dose exposure. You already suspected that. I knew the poisoning had to begin slowly if the person responsible wanted your symptoms to look ordinary. He was silent for several seconds. I want you to help me build the case. Anything you observe needs to be documented and supported by physical evidence. Suspicion will not be enough. I understand. I'm not asking because I'm incapable of investigating my own household, he continued. I'm asking because people behave differently around you. You see what I cannot. I thought of Julian's smiling face and the body I had inhabited while falling from the rooftop. I want to live. In this life, that means Julian must be stopped before he succeeds. Damien held my gaze. Then our interests are aligned. Over the next 6 weeks, we gathered evidence carefully. Damien arranged for blood samples to be analyzed by an independent laboratory under a different name. The reports found traces of a heavy metal compound once used in specialized bookbinding ink. It had been discontinued years earlier and was unlikely to appear through ordinary environmental exposure. The servant who had handled Damien's tea was not immediately reported to the authorities. Damien first had investigators follow his financial activity and movements. They discovered that the man had received a large payment 6 months before our weddings and had recently been staying at a secondary property controlled by Julian. A second employee in the Ashford kitchen had been adding what she believed were nutritional supplements to Damien's imported cigars. Julian's intermediary had told her the powder was a treatment intended to reduce stress. She had no idea it contained anything dangerous. When I heard her worrying about whether she had used the correct amount during a grocery delivery, I reported it to Damien. The remaining powder was secured and tested. Its chemical profile matched the substance found in Damien's blood. The evidence changed the timeline completely. Julian's plan had begun before Celeste chose him, before our weddings, and before the family knew which brother either of us would marry. Celeste's decision had not created his scheme. It had simply made it easier for him to position himself as the father of a potential heir. He planned this before the marriage selection, Damien said while reviewing the laboratory report. Yes, Celeste believed she was stealing my future, but Julian would have continued whether she chose him or not. She chose him because of what happened to you in the previous life, he said slowly. I had told Damien part of the truth by then. I had not explained every detail of the rebirth or my ability, but I had admitted that I possessed knowledge of a possible future in which Julian inherited after Damien's death. Damien had responded as he responded to everything else, by testing what could be tested and setting aside what could not. She chose for herself, I said. She saw the position I reached and wanted it. She never cared how I reached it or what Julian had done to me. Damien closed the folder. The annual Ashford Foundation Gala is in 2 weeks. Beatrice will attend, along with the full board, our legal advisors, and every family member whose support Julian has been cultivating. Everyone who matters will be in one room. Yes, he rested his hand on the evidence folder. Can we be ready? We already are. On the night of the gala, Celeste wore white. Julian moved through the reception with the same effortless smile that had convinced people for years that he was the kinder Ashford brother. He greeted donors, remembered spouses' names, and made older relatives feel as though their opinions mattered. Anyone watching him from a distance would have seen a charming man supporting his family. I wore black and the restored black rose necklace. The Ashford jeweler had replaced the damaged clasp with a stronger one, though I had not told him how the original had been weakened. Damien arrived on time and stood beside me in public for the first time since our wedding. His expression was as controlled as ever, but there was a difference in his stillness. He no longer looked like a man waiting for an attack he could not identify. He looked like a man who had identified it and chosen the moment to respond. Beatrice noticed. She noticed everything. The Foundation Awards presentation began midway through the evening. Damien stepped to the podium for the annual family address. He thanked the Foundation's partners, acknowledged the year's work, and reviewed several new commitments. Then he placed a folder on the podium. I need to address a matter concerning the protection of this family and its institutions, he said. He did not accuse Julian in an emotional speech. He turned the presentation over to the family's independent legal counsel, who had been seated in the third row. The attorney explained that evidence of a sustained poisoning attempt had been documented, verified, and provided to the appropriate authorities. The laboratory findings were presented first. Then came the payment records linking Julian's property to the servant who handled Damien's tea. The investigators had obtained a signed statement from that servant after confronting him with the transfers and the laboratory results. The remaining supplement from the kitchen had been tested and matched the compound in Damien's blood. Records also showed that Julian had gained indirect access to Damien's household 18 months earlier through a business arrangement with one of the estate managers. Finally, the attorney explained the financial motive. If Damien died without a child, Julian intended to challenge the succession structure and take control of the Ashford companies. Draft documents recovered during the investigation showed that he had already begun preparing fraudulent changes to support that claim. The room fell silent. It was not the polite silence of people listening to a speech. It was the stunned stillness of hundreds of guests realizing that the man smiling among them had been planning his brother's death. Julian maintained his expression for nearly a minute. Then his gaze moved toward Celeste. Her thoughts reached me from across the room. He said it was a vitamin supplement. He said it would help Damien's stress. He told me he was looking after the household. Celeste had known that Julian was controlling. She had ignored the restrictions, the medical pressure, and the way he isolated her. She had participated in sabotaging my wedding. In our previous life, she had murdered me. But she had not known he was poisoning Damien. That fact did not erase anything she had done, yet it mattered. Julian tried to explain the evidence in several different ways. He claimed the payments were for domestic services unrelated to Damien. The payment dates and messages contradicted him. He argued that the laboratory samples could have been contaminated. The matching batch information from the supplement made that explanation impossible. Then he turned toward Celeste and said she had known about everything. Celeste stood so quickly that her chair struck the floor behind her. "No," she said. Her voice was quieter than his but unexpectedly steady. "I did not know you were poisoning him." Julian looked at her, and for the first time in either of my lives, his face lost its careful performance. The tenderness vanished. What remained was small, furious, and ugly. He had expected Celeste to protect him because he believed possession and loyalty were the same thing. Beatrice rose from the main table. She understood that the family would be judged not only by Julian's actions but by its response. "Remove him from the event," she said. Security officers who had already been briefed approached Julian. The family's legal counsel confirmed that the evidence had been preserved and submitted for criminal investigation. Julian was escorted from the hall while the guests watched in silence. Celeste found me in the estate garden 1 week later. She looked as though the previous days had removed something from her. She was still beautiful, but the certainty that had always driven her was gone. She sat beside me without asking permission. "I only wanted what you had," she said. "I know." She stared at her hands. "I had the wrong idea about your life. Yes. I kept telling myself Julian was only protective. Every time something felt wrong, I found an explanation because I didn't want to admit what I had chosen. I studied her face. In our previous life, she had asked why I deserved a better ending. She had never understood that my ending had been built on years of control, fear, and the death of a man whose murder benefited my husband. "You didn't want my life," I said. "You wanted the last page. You saw the money, the position, and the children. You never looked at what came before any of it." She closed her eyes. "In this life, you chose the entire story for yourself." For a while, neither of us spoke. I did not forgive her. Her ignorance of Julian's poisoning did not erase the dress, the necklace, the jealousy, or the memory of her hands dragging me from a rooftop, but I no longer needed revenge against her. Julian had already shown her what she had been so desperate to possess. "The Bennett family asked whether you plan to return home," I said. "Beatrice has agreed to support the dissolution of your marriage as long as the investigation confirms you were not involved in Julian's crimes. The attorneys reviewed your statement, and so far it matches the evidence." Celeste looked up. "You're letting me leave? What happens to you is no longer my decision. You can go home, cooperate with the investigation, and decide what kind of life you want to build. I don't have a stake in it anymore. That's all. That's all I have left to give you." I stood and left her in the garden. The legal process against Julian moved quickly once the records were organized. The Ashford companies removed him from every position of authority, froze the accounts connected to the fraudulent transfers, and turned the evidence over to the state prosecutor. The case included the attempted poisoning, the conspiracy involving household staff, and the falsified succession documents. His attorneys challenged portions of the evidence and asked for leniency, but the laboratory reports, financial records, physical samples, and witness statements supported one another too closely to dismiss. Beatrice attended one preliminary hearing. She spoke briefly about the damage Julian had caused to the family, its employees, and the institutions that trusted the Ashford name. Then she left without looking at him. Celeste's marriage was formally dissolved after investigators found no evidence that she had participated in the poisoning. She returned to the Bennett household. We did not rebuild our relationship. Occasionally, I heard news about her through relatives, but I stopped measuring my happiness against her failures. That comparison had poisoned both of our lives long before Julian ever touched Damien's tea. Damien and I did not fall in love suddenly. Nothing involving him happened suddenly. Our relationship changed in increments so small that I often recognized them only after they had already become permanent. At first, he told me facts. He explained which businesses required attention, which board members were resisting changes, and what Beatrice expected from the foundation. He spoke to me as he would speak to a competent colleague. Then he began asking for my opinion and waiting for the answer, instead of treating the question as a courtesy. We disagreed seriously over 2 estate management decisions. He won one argument because his experience was greater. I won the other because I understood how the household staff would react to the proposed changes. Damien seemed faintly surprised that losing an argument to me did not feel like a threat. I realized then how few people had ever challenged him without trying to manipulate him. One evening, he returned earlier than usual and found me in the study reviewing the household accounts. The tea beside me had gone cold. Without saying anything, he carried the cup to the kitchen and returned with a fresh one. He placed it near my hand, sat at his own desk, and began working. We remained in the same room for 2 hours without speaking. It was the most comfortable silence I had experienced in either life. Months later, on a cold evening in November, we stood on the terrace overlooking the city. Damien watched the lights below us for a long time before speaking. "I was never good at wanting anything," he said. "Wanting something always seemed like a weakness someone else could use." I waited. With Damien, silence was not an absence. It was space he needed in order to say something honestly. Then you stood beside me as though you had already decided my life was worth protecting. You didn't ask me to become warmer, easier, or more impressive. You didn't demand anything in exchange. He turned toward me. I don't know exactly when it changed. I only know that it did. I thought about Celeste's attempts to force her way into his life during our previous existence. She had tried beauty, seduction, pressure, and humiliation. None of it had reached him because every gesture had been designed to obtain something from him. What reached Damien was not pursuit. It was partnership. In my first life, I mistook obsession for love, I told him. I chose the man who wanted constant access to me, and I never asked whether being wanted was the same as being respected. Damien listened without interrupting. You taught me that safety doesn't have to be cold, I continued. Sometimes it's quieter than passion. Sometimes it looks like someone believing the evidence, protecting your authority, and bringing you a new cup of tea without making you grateful for it. His expression softened so slightly that another person might not have noticed. I didn't expect any of this either. 2 years later, Beatrice announced her formal retirement during a spring board dinner. She had directed the Ashford family's social structure and philanthropic work for decades, and no one questioned that she had built much of the influence the family still possessed. By then, I had already assumed many of her responsibilities. The announcement simply gave a name to the role I had been performing. As Beatrice left the dining room, she paused beside me. "You never begged for a place here," she said. "No." "Good. People who are capable of carrying authority rarely need to beg for it." Then she walked away. At the Ashford Foundation Gala the following autumn, Damien stood behind me at the dressing table and fastened the black rose necklace around my neck himself. His hands were careful with the clasp. He had learned, as I had, that even the smallest mechanisms could be weakened by someone patient enough to hide the damage. The clasp closed and held. I looked at our reflection. Damien met my eyes in the mirror, and neither of us needed to say anything. Celeste had believed she was stealing my fate when she chose Julian. She never understood that the life she wanted was the life I had been grateful to escape. The cold, silent man she left behind as my punishment became the only person in either of my lives who looked at me without trying to own, reshape, or break what he saw. He did not rescue me, and I did not rescue him. We uncovered the truth, protected one another, and built something neither of us had known how to ask for. Celeste wanted my ending. I gave her the story I no longer wanted, and then I wrote a different one for myself.